thank you so much for being here, both for being here at the last event of the day, I think, but also for coming to my talk. So I really, really appreciate it. My name is Clare Dillon, and I'm here to give a kind of, I suppose, a series of my thoughts around this idea of team topologies and how the trend in looking at team topologies might help, if we look at that, might help our efforts to actually get funding and build business cases for both OSPOs and ISPOs. But I'm going to start by getting a little bit of situational awareness now to see who's in the room here. So this will help me as I go through to understand where you're all coming from. So first of all, who knows what InnerSource is? Pretty much everyone. So the use of open source practices and principles within an organization to create proprietary code, that's good. So when I say ISPO, I mean InnerSource Program Office, which may be a term you don't know, but it is an emerging concept. But does everyone know what an OSPO and an ISPO is then? If I've just told you what an ISPO is. Yes, okay, pretty universal, that's great. Anyone involved in building a business case, new or sustaining, for an OSPO or an ISPO? More likely to be an OSPO. Excellent. Failed is good. We learn through failures. Not everyone does it right all the time, and certainly most of us have all failed, and next time might be better. So next one is, who has funding, got experience in terms of getting funding in large organizations? Like that would have been there. Very good now. So smaller number, but they're the people we're really trying to learn from, so we'll have questions for you all later. And who'd be familiar with team topologies as an idea? Okay, good few folks. Do you read the book, like, in terms of actually understanding what that's about? And we'll be going into that, so I'll give you a brief overview of what that is. And now that we know who's in the room, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of where I'm coming from, because it kind of helps give context. I started my journey back in 1996 with startups as product manager, moved into doing tech evangelism in Microsoft for 14 years. For the last 7 years, I was part of the leadership team in Microsoft Ireland, leading out the developer evangelism organization. So I suppose from that perspective, have been thinking a lot about the idea of the decision-making process of large organizations. It was actually my experience in that organization that put me on the path that I'm at now, because when I was in Microsoft, we spent a lot of time doing pilot and kind of trying to get folks involved, big enterprises, to adopt the latest Microsoft technologies. And I suppose the big observation I had and my learning from that time was that even if something is technically feasible and makes logical sense, doesn't mean it will be adopted and doesn't mean it will be funded. So I think part of my journey since that has been exploring why and looking at some of the, I suppose, organizational and even psychological, I suppose, trends or constraints that mean that people fund things or don't fund things. So in 2017, when I left Microsoft, I actually moved more into this inner source and open source world, actually primarily because I was fascinated by the idea of how collaboration works from that personal and organizational perspective, and how the open source principles and practices can help with collaboration actually happening, and indeed, I suppose, progress being made on these big collaborative efforts. And then, after I was involved in that for so long, I got so excited by it that I decided to start a part-time PhD to start looking at the concept of InnerSource. And so more recently, I've moved into the academic world. As I said, I'm a PhD student with the University of Galway. That's also part of a research centre called Lero, involved in the OSPO there. And in my day job, I work in a community called CURIOSS, which is a community for university and research institution OSPOs. And we talk about how to enable open source in that academic setting. And I'm involved in the CHAOSS project as well. So that's a kind of an overview of where I've come from and where I'm going. And what we're going to talk about today is maybe some thoughts that have emerged in my head as I've been thinking about the confluence of these different experiences and trends, to see how it might apply to the idea of getting funding for OSPOs. So everyone knows what an OSPO and ISPO is, so I won't go into this in detail. What I will say is that in the academic space, Zotero is a great tool for kind of gathering together links and things. And I've actually created a Zotero group for OSPO stuff, so if you're interested in like loads of links to OSPO papers and articles and all the rest of it, might be something that you might be interested in. Happy to have you join the group and add in links, that would be great. And the ISPO idea is a relatively new one, but in InnerSource Commons, which is a foundation that I have been involved in since 2018, They have an ISPO working group where you can talk about all things about enabling ISPOs, or InnerSource, should I say, within organizations. So that's something they might be interested in. So my goal here today is to talk about how we're securing funding for, I would say, enabling teams or organizational constructs like OSPOs and ISPOs, which are essentially centers of competency who are trying to actually help practices be adopted by large organizations. And everything I'm talking about today, it's not that it's proven, it's just a set of things that I'm talking about that I'm actually trying to tease out. Is this a thread that's worth pulling? Is this something that might be worth exploring for us as a community in terms of how we think about going about getting funding? And so if we think about how OSPOs, and I'm going to focus on OSPOs here because there's a lot more documentation available on the OSPO trend than there are on ISPOs. So for some of these, I will just use the example of open source program offices. But if we look at the value propositions and activities that OSPOs are typically engaged in, and I'm taking this from some of the work that the To-Do group has done, if you think about the kinds of activities that they typically, or the priorities that they're looking to, they're often among these types of topics, right? So this is a summary of one of the papers that they've put out. And I know that great work has been done to align the work that OSPOs do with what are often organizational macro priorities. Things like risk and compliance, innovation, talent, sustainability, strategic engagement. There's a lot of effort that's already been done, great work that's been done to align the work that OSPOs do with some of these strategic priorities. And indeed, one can even look at the kinds of OSPO activities and think about how that actually then maps to these bigger organizational challenges. And if you look at how, I suppose, OSPOs are typically, people in OSPOs are spending their time, this might be a list, and this would be a question to all of you because I'm not sure the data is available about this, but if you had to break down how folks in OSPOs spend their time, you might think that this might be a kind of a list of how they do it. I don't know, like in terms of how much effort they put into the various different things. I know that a lot of work goes on in compliance and risk management because that's often been proven to be an industry or an organizational concern. Education evangelism is often up there, community engagement, policy. It happens, but it's often like, not necessarily an everyday task. Tooling and infrastructure might be something we'll look at again because I was just speaking to Thomas earlier, it is a trend where more and more organizations are getting into automating some of the work that OSPOs do, but metrics and reporting might be just something that you do every now and again. So I think that the challenge is that you might go to the point and the work of actually building a business case for something like an OSPO. And you might have already aligned everything that an OSPO does with the organizational priorities. And you might think to yourself, tick, job done. I have made a concrete case and a very logical argument for why this makes absolute sense for this organization. And you might think that your work is done because once something makes logical sense for an organization, they will obviously fund it, right? I mean, that's just what happens. You've made the case, you've handed it to the right person, and it will all magically make itself work. But of course, that's not how it actually works in real life, because it's a hard job of work to go from the theory of something to actually getting buy-in from the group of people that need to have buy-in to a decision in order for you to get money, significant money year on year. So, typically looks something like this, where you've got to actually teach them about the value of open source. What is open source? Do your executives know what open source is? Now you have to actually get them onto the whole idea of why an OSPO is necessary to do open source well. They may not know what an OSPO is. They don't know what the activities are. They don't know what they're buying into. Then you have to build a business case that's specific for your organization and your context. Then you have to find the executive sponsor, someone who's going to take it to the board because they won't let you in the door. So you have to actually find someone who's willing to sponsor you at that level. And then you have to get the consensus that everyone agrees that it's a good idea. And then you literally have to potentially rinse and repeat that annually because the people may not be the same people, the context may be different, and just because you got it last year doesn't mean you'll get it this year. So that's a job of work in itself. And I think it's made even harder when you think about the current landscape, right? So most people would admit that we're working in a landscape today that is far more volatile, far more uncertain, far more complex, and far more ambiguous than at any time in the history of most of our industries. What with everything from, I don't know, tariffs, AI, many other things that are kind of coming over the landscape to try and muddy the waters about what we focus on and what we prioritize. The scope of what is changing is far beyond what a lot of people can handle as organizations. The pace of change is increasing at all times. So we're in a really volatile landscape from a business perspective. And I guess there is often fierce competition for executive mind space and indeed what they spend their money on. So even if you have a really valid business case for why you need an OSPO or an ISPO, that may just not get the attention that it deserves because there are so many other things that are on the list of the executives which they have to knock off before they even get to this thing that you only started educating them about what it actually means or what the acronyms stand for. And this is the real challenge, I think, that is facing many of us today. It's not about building a valid, logical argument. It's about competing against the many other valid, logical arguments that everyone's already nodding to around the table. And so you're competing for the same pool of money that these people are actually looking for. And that's a challenge. But if you thought that was the only challenge, I'm sorry to tell you that there is more, because if you actually look at sales and marketing research, then you will actually find out that it's becoming harder and harder to get executives to spend money on anything. They will not make a decision. And what happens is that because of this volatile landscape, people are finding it harder and harder to have one person make a decision. They kind of like to get a consensus on everything so no one's to blame. And once you actually get more than a couple people involved in any decision, the risk of them not making a decision at all is actually higher than the chances of them making a decision. So you see that if you have more, so the increased number of decision makers is now a fact. You have up to 6.8 decision makers in any big financial decision. And if you get more than 6 stakeholders involved, then the buying decision, and you can take this as an investment decision, can go down to less than 30%, or just around 30%, which means that they'd be far more likely to say, do we really need one? Because really, we've got a lot of things to spend on. It might be risky doing a new thing. And they're far more likely to do nothing rather than take an investment risk on a new thing that they don't really understand. So that's challenging. And what I'm going to be talking about today then is how we can kind of piggyback on trends that maybe they're already nodding about, that they've already decided are a good idea. And the reason why I'm exploring this is simply because you still don't have to do that initial kind of frame-breaking, mental model-breaking, forming work that you might assume that you have to do if you start from scratch trying to educate them to the value of open source. Because if you have to do that work, you will be behind all the people who are taking the buzzwords from the top list of priorities who've already got their investment. And I think that that's also a big challenge. So let's look at how we can piggyback on trends. And the trend that I'm going to explore is this idea of team topologies. So some of you are familiar with the book and the concept of team topologies. It came out, I think, in 2019 by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais. And it is very popular in the kind of platform engineering DevOps space. And it has been referenced by a lot of organizations as being the companion to things like Accelerate or the Phoenix Project, where there's been a lot of discussion around the technical infrastructure required for DevOps. And this is kind of a companion for management that talks about, now that you've decided that DevOps is a thing, how do you actually organize your company to deliver the value that promises? I will say that there is a second edition coming out, and that's one of the reasons why I've picked this topic, because second editions mean a new wave of interest, a new wave of promotion, a new wave of the authors going out there telling us about the value of team topologies. And that means that that's an opportunity for anyone who might be able to position things in the light of that. It was very popular at the time. It won awards about the product being one of the best product management books, being one of the best management books. You'll notice here about the audience So whereas things like OSPOs and open source might be well known in the developer community, executives who are making investment decisions are not quite so familiar with them. But these are the books that are being read by the people who have the purse strings, and that's why, again, it might be interesting to be seen how we align to their concepts. So most of the goals around the idea of team topologies, I'm a huge fan of the book. I really would recommend it as a read, simply because it talks about this idea of how do you optimize an organization for the fast flow of value. That's essentially the principles behind DevOps. It's the principles behind the Team Topologies book, which is not limited to the case of DevOps. But the idea of how do we optimize for this flow of value is an important one. And more importantly for me, I think, this reducing cognitive load. I mean, how many people feel like they have too many things to think about all the time? Right? So the idea of having too much to consider in order to be able to make progress is a problem, again, that has been compounded by the VUCA world we live in. So this idea of optimizing for cognitive load in teams, I think, is a very natural one and one that we should explore. And this idea of how do you evolve teams quickly. And it takes a team-based view of all of these types of challenges. And it looks at what are the optimal team sizes, what's the optimal team cognitive load and type of cognitive load, what's the types of team interactions that are optimal for given contexts, and what is the team lifespan, which is very important when we think about how we position the work that an OSPO does, because there is inbuilt assumptions in the Team Topologies book about what the optimal lifespan of a particular type of engagement in an organization is. And so it takes all these concepts, and it came up with, I think if I had to summarize it, two things. I've taken this for some of the Team Topologies websites. They have four fundamental, what they call team topologies, or team shapes, or kind of patterns that they see. First is a stream-aligned team, which you can think of as a kind of a major product delivery or something that has delivering customer value. They have this idea of enabling team, which is someone who comes in and helps that team do something, learn a practice, learn a better way of doing things. There is a complicated subsystem. You can think of that as kind of experts that are brought in. You don't need everyone to have this skill, but you want to have some people have particular expertise. And this idea of platform teams, which is essentially the fundamental of platform engineering and DevOps, and how you actually take out things that can be automated and put them into an automated platform team, and it makes everyone more efficient. Coupled with that are the concepts. Oh no, first of all, I'll talk about these teams. Okay, so first of all, this is just a summary of what they are. You can see the stream-aligned, deliver end-to-end customer value, customer journey. There's a lot of talk about how that should be end-to-end and not necessarily broken up between, say, for example, product delivery and then running the product and then customer support, and how they should all be integrated so that people own the whole journey. There is the enabling team, which is this idea of coaching or guidance or knowledge transfer. Importantly here, and I'll come to this later, there's a notion that enabling team engagements should be short-term. The idea is that once you pass on the knowledge, then your job is done, and you are of finite value to that entire process. There's a complicated subsystem team, which is this idea of expertise knowledge, and as I mentioned, the platform, which are things like internal platforms. And not only do they recommend what the teams should be, but they talk about, oh, that's me just going through those. They talk about the types of interactions that should happen between these teams. And there are three types of interactions. One is collaboration. We all know about collaboration, but the idea is, and one of the things they talk about in the book, is that the kind of collaboration they're talking about here is really expensive collaboration, and shouldn't necessarily happen all the time in all contexts, and actually should minimize the amount of expensive collaboration, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of mental power, a lot of cognitive load. And indeed, the optimal thing is having X as a service, right? Where you actually have something that is familiar, is repeatable, is scalable, that you can do with very little cognitive overload, and that kind of interaction can be very efficient. And then this idea of facilitating, which would be something that often the enabling team does, which is that you're making something happen more easily. So they have this concept of how you facilitate. So this is how they have a little way of actually mapping these, and it comes into a picture that looks something like this, where you might have an enabling team that might be, say, agile coaches. They could be the developer experience team. They're doing something that is teaching a core development team how to do something better. You might have something like a security expertise or AI expertise that you're actually pulling into the team as needed, but doesn't happen all the time. You can see here that they're having the collaboration that's quite expensive, so you wouldn't want them doing that all the time because it would suck up all the brain power of the team, but you do pull them in as necessary. And you have this idea of platforms that might be CI/CD pipelines or something like that, or dashboards. And then what all of this is designed to do is to make sure that the stream-aligned team, the end customer value, is optimized. So they can focus on the customer value. They're not thinking about, or they're learning how to do things better all the time. They're not thinking about a whole lot of expert stuff that everyone doesn't have to know, but they need to pull in as necessary. And anything that can be automated is automated. That's the end goal for Team Topologies. So now let's look at the OSPO, ISPO value proposition activities through this new lens. So this is the table we had earlier. And when I was looking at the activities and the value proposition, most of what you see OSPOs positioning themselves at can often be this idea of enabling, right? They're doing it, certainly in the educational space, where I work in the academic space, there's lots of emphasis on we're teaching skills, we're helping people do things better. And I think that's really interesting, except, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of an expectation, if you're coming with the mental model of Team Topologies, that that's a short-term activity, that once you do it, it's done. So, you know, how many times do we have to build a new curriculum around open source skills and practices? How many times do you have to give you a template document for how you choose an open source license? You might want to do it once or twice, but I don't expect that I'm paying for it in 5 years, because I paid for it 5 years ago. So that's a challenge. Secondly, there is this idea of the expertise required from open source perspective that can sometimes be considered a complicated subsystem in my mind. So the idea of having deep expertise in security or licensing, particularly in areas that change often, and that is considered terribly valuable, but indeed the interactions are valued only in terms of what they enable the stream-aligned teams to do. And then I would say that this idea of platforms may be becoming increasingly relevant. So the idea of providing tools and technology that scale, most importantly, that are efficient, that provide a kind of an API for teams to do something at scale and very efficiently, in this lens, is considered incredibly valuable, because it is one of the most efficient things that you can be providing for the organization that helps more and more people over time, and that has a scalable factor. It's not a time suck, and it's not something that is a one-to-one engagement that can't scale. I mean, OSPOs are rarely stream-aligned teams because they're rarely delivering customer value, so that's the final one there. So if you looked at that same picture and tried to map in some of the OSPO activities, it might look like this. Maybe the best practices in coaching and training that OSPO does might be an enabling function. The idea of having domain expertise in terms of licensing, like where you bring in the legal experts around which license to use and whether we're in contravening an existing license or how you mix licenses. This is where you kind of go, you need to talk to the lawyer about that, and you roll in the lawyer. That's fine, well appropriate. This idea of the automated tools for things like SBOM checking or for license checking, that work would be there for a platform team. And again, that basically is designed to enable the stream-aligned teams to be the most efficient they could possibly be. So, looking at that, and thinking about what we talked about earlier, if the enabling team is this coaching, training, blah, 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 then I think one of the risks that is posed by people having this mental frame is that that's seen to be kind of finite. It's seen to be an effort that, sure, once we get them all doing it right, do we have to continue doing that? I mean, how long do we have to coach people to do open source practices before they actually get it? This may be a question that's in people's minds, and it may be the reason why OSPOs may find it a little bit more difficult if that's your primary function and activity and you're trying to add value. Just because you come back next year and go, oh, we trained 100 people last year and we trained 200 people this year. They may be still looking at you going, how long is this going to take? I mean, how often or how long do I have to keep funding you to get to a point of change? And we all know that change is hard. I'm not saying that the reality or the logical facts don't suggest that that's a long journey, but executives are not thinking like that. They're thinking, is this a finite effort? How long will it take? How long do I have to fund it? On the other hand, the complicated subsystem side of things is indeed harder to cut, usually because it's directly correlated to risk, or it can be directly correlated to adding value to a streamlined team, as long as it is. As long as the value you're offering is being offered to teams that are really important. Now, there are some scenarios where people are offering licenses or license advice or individual coaching to anyone who asks for it, and that can sometimes lead to OSPOs' efforts, their efforts, being sucked into perhaps the less valued stream-aligned teams, if you get my gist, because it's their job to offer effort or offer advice, and so the first people coming on the queue might be the first people serviced. But the question I would ask in this context is, of the really important stream-aligned teams in an organization, how many of them have you helped in the last year and to what degree? And will they tell executives that you are indispensable and critical to the organization's function? And indeed, the platform, for me, is probably the least likely to be cuttable, if you get my gist. So when you're actually building infrastructure that people then become reliant on, and it's part of a pipeline or it's part of a process, then that's very hard to cut because it's part of the organization's running. And it's really hard to pull that out without causing huge pain. Whereas if you stop doing training, look, we all know that that's not a good thing, but you all know what gets cut first when people have to cut something, right? So I would say that as you move down this, you're more likely to have maybe more dependability in terms of the value you're offering back if executives are looking at it with this team topology lens. So, as mentioned, I think that if I was thinking about demonstrating OSPO value with now this lens in mind, you might be thinking about maybe emphasizing the fact that the enablement work isn't ever done. I mean, we know that's never done, right? But you can't just keep going back to the same teams enabling them still. Like if you have a set number of people with a low turnover of staff, then someone's going to ask the question as to how long does it take you to enable them? And how often do I have to keep paying for the same work to be done year on year? Versus if you are an organization that perhaps has a large number of new team formation and a large turnover in staff, that's possibly a much more valid criteria that you could pitch to an organization. And as I mentioned, I think that the idea of ongoing long-term initiatives in the space have to be very carefully positioned in order to compete against other what are seen to be priority investments. Because even if it's not cut long-term, sometimes organizations feel like they can pause it for a year or two. But pausing it for a year or two is also detrimental to efforts in the longer term. So it's really hard to start these things again once they lose momentum. But I do think that there is probably another case to be made about the rapidly changing environment and how even if you went to Team A, that's a very important stream-aligned team last year, the case has changed. I mean, certainly in the open source world, let me tell you about the CRA, let me tell you about the AI Act, let me tell you about all these new things that are coming out about best practices in open source. There is definitely a case to be made to say, but you have to make the case that the landscape is changing so rapidly that this ongoing enablement effort is worth it. Then in the context of complicated subsystems, well, again, I think this idea of not just having expertise on call, not just having that expertise on call for very important high-value teams, but also this idea that that expertise has to be updated on a regular basis is, again, incredibly important. And then, there are options in terms of actually offering platform-type services, which is the idea of, it's much easier to pull usage metrics and report metrics from something like a platform, so that would be a good thing in the context of actually delivering value. But the other thing would be, and the risk here is, of course, once something is built, that it might get subsumed into some sort of other CI/CD platform team, right? So now you've built it, we'll just take it over here into whoever's running the rest of the platform stuff. And now what do the people in the OSPO do? Well, there is a case to be made that there should be a roadmap of enhancements and updates that might need to be developed by someone who has domain expertise. So that might be both the risk and the opportunity in that context. So I'm going to leave some final thoughts. This was an exploration by me to try and map what I saw as the activities and the priorities into a world where some people are thinking. And what it really highlighted to me was that there are sometimes things we think make sense from our lens and our perspective. If you're looking at it from this other lens and you've read the book and you're a really big fan, then you might be looking at it going, didn't Team Topologies tell me that enabling teams should really only be a finite investment and I shouldn't be doing it over the long term? So these are the mental models that some executives have. And my attempt here is to try and think about how do we address that. So I suppose the other point that should be made is that you can take from this that for me, the idea of building a business case for an OSPO and ISPO is a difficult task, first of all. And the notion that we start by educating people and then we get finally to a decision to invest is logical, but hard, and it takes a long time, and it needs constant effort. And sometimes the idea that you can piggyback on an existing trend is something that should be explored, is really where I'm getting to here. And if we do take the Team Topologies as a potential trend to piggyback on, then you want to think about the idea of OSPO as an enabling team. That's good, particularly as an entry point. So really good for new OSPOs saying, we don't have this critical industry relevant expertise. I need to come in and enable the team. But be aware that that may be considered to be a finite effort, and or there may be an expectation that that stops after a period of time. You might want to anchor the value in expert knowledge. I mean, people do, but I'm just kind of reinforcing that point. And anchor it in terms of having other people, particularly stream-aligned teams, talk about the value that these experts are providing. You may want to think about the idea of what are the repeatable services or platform-type offerings that you can offer that are considered to be incredibly efficient, that are this X as a service type of interaction, that therefore scale, that can be considered to be really good long-term investments by a company. And then the idea of engagements with external open source organizations or communities or projects, that one caused me a bit of bother because it doesn't really cover it as much in the book. But I do think that the idea of boundary spanning engagements could probably be a complicated subsystem, particularly if it's a dependency or a known dependency and a critical dependency for a very important stream-aligned team. So that could be, and indeed, the idea of being a conduit for information to flow from a very important stream-aligned team to an external community could be something critical that couldn't be taken away, particularly if the team recognizes the value of that engagement. So I guess in all of this, the real critical thing is organizations care about the customer value. They don't care as much about all the other stuff as long as it makes the customer value team the most efficient possible. So in all cases, it really is about understanding what the context of your organization is, who are those teams, and in the context of making a business case, I'll leave this with you, that oftentimes an OSPO making the business case for itself is seen to be biased in the first place. A stream-aligned team making an argument for an OSPO is very powerful. So I'll leave that one too. It doesn't just matter about making a business case, it's who presents the business case. And the value can often be very, very powerful as well. So they are my thoughts. And I am really interested in what you think of them and whether or not this is a topic that we might want to explore further. I had the pleasure of meeting Matthew Skelton there a while ago, and he was very interested in exploring the idea of how this might align or not, as the case may be. So I guess my point is, how do we think that might work? Do you think that this is an interesting idea to explore further? Or any kind of feedback that people might have? I'm happy to open it up to comments, questions, anything anyone would like.
very interesting talk because it sort of highlights what is underpinning of what we're doing with the OSPO. It's like, oh, you pull away the cover, the curtain, what is happening. And then looking at the three team topologies, it's like, well, we do all of them a bit. So it's like diversify token investment. So what do you make of that?
Do you mean diversify how we pitch it, like in terms of like pitching it in different ways, or?
What you're actually doing in practice to establish yourself and keep it going.
So I do think that what this gives you is the expectation of a type of team. So I guess the point would be, you know, as you're thinking about presenting the efforts of an OSPO, it just might be worthwhile having a look at the expectations of those types of teams. So for me, the learning from this was, like, definitely think about that scalability thing. If I've seen OSPO reports where they're like, we've trained 100 people and then we upped it to 120. And you're like thinking, that's not going to get executives excited because, number one, it's not delivering the value to the really important 50 people over here in the Streamline team, because you were doing all entry-level training, fantastic, but highly, if these guys over here tell me they want something, I'm going to invest in that. So it's about trying to look at the, I don't think it justifies different diversified streaming or sources. I just think that as you do reporting, you need to think about the lenses that people look at and the expectations of the thing you think is a really great result, but they may not, because, and again, from a competitive perspective, because they're looking at the other teams that are delivering value and what, if they took the investment from you and they gave it to those guys over there, what would they get out of it? And so you're in that kind of competitive scenario.
Claire, can you move the slide back to where the overview is?
This one? Or the previous one?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So the funny thing is, I had a discussion. I talked to, as dual ambassador, I talked to all of things, and this reminds you of a discussion that I recently had with several executives, primarily CEOs and CEO. So the funny thing is, when you look at the enabling team, what the OSPO does in training, the direct answer that I have, yeah, well, training, what do you mean? We don't spend money on training anymore. Let them do the LinkedIn training. Just LinkedIn learning, done. OSPO enabling team, no value. Knowledge Expert Center, yeah, we want to see if we can outsource this to an external learner. So when we have the external outsource, we'll just boom, we'll outsource it. Then APIs, they were like, yeah, but we'll just buy a tooling vendor and we're done, right? So the whole case for the OSPO is completely on the. If literally I look at executives, and I had this already earlier, executives are focused on what brings value to their particular company. Everything else, they buy in from, do what everybody else does. And so everybody learning, enabling, externally outsourced. Experts, externally outsourced. So the only way where, when I had the discussion about this, is what I've also been doing is working across all of the domains. So providing them something that they cannot outsource, they cannot buy, they cannot from LinkedIn, which is the cross combination, which is the gap between like legal, security, business, engineering, and actually be able to work in between the gaps of all those different teams, because that they can't. So yes, you need to have a foundation in the API stuff, in like building the platform, the enabling, the automation stuff. That's always there. Try not to buy a commercial tool, if you can, because that usually means that you are outsourceable. It's really like that. If you buy an external commercial tool, there will be external outsourcers in India that can do it cheaper. Not to be negative, but that's
Thank you for those insights. But I mean, it is common feedback, right? So I think Thomas has just illustrated the kind of different thought processes, how some executives think. And again, it's been bred from years of people telling them that the most efficient thing to do is outsource, right? Even if those outsourced experts don't have the domain context that you may have sitting in the organization. And I think, I mean, one challenge that the kind of filling the gaps collaborative service argument might also have is that I'm not sure that executives automatically see that value either. They kind of expect collaboration to just happen because I gave you a book on it last week. You know, it's not. They don't understand the difficulty and the effort required to potentially do that. But this pull towards it's more efficient to get someone else to deal with this, and I just have to give that maybe outsource money, I only pay for it as I use it versus staff internally is a real one. However, there is a kind of a trend that's been recognized in more recent times of actually people pulling back from that outsource model. So these things are always a pendulum. There definitely was a pendulum that went well over to we'll outsource everything. And I think when you look at some of the recent trends, that pendulum is starting to move back. And it's starting to move back because of this understanding that in particular, like in times of other things being important like AI and compliance and security, that there is a domain expertise that is required to actually optimize for these sort of things. And that sometimes the external outsourcer may not know enough of that, or there may be enough experience of failed digital transformation projects being offered by external vendors, that really the value of bringing that back internally and building some of this value, and importantly, the relationship with, for example, these stream-aligned teams, that can be very, very powerful. So one of the things I would counter to this, it's all the same if we just outsource, is that in this sort of dynamic, I'd love to say that even in the context of a competitive scenario, that the decision is always made based on figures and a spreadsheet somewhere that says this makes most sense. But oftentimes it's very influenced by what your star developer in the stream-aligned team told you at the coffee machine. And if they can tell you that they love their OSPO, you probably will have a better chance of actually being funded next year. So that would be maybe something that potentially could counter. I'm just going to go back here for a comment.
I very much appreciate your optimism that we're swinging back to internalizing, but I'm pretty sure we're currently doing a detour in direction of AI and LLM. So basically, before hiring new engineers, I think we're currently trying to outsource to another thing, and I'm not really sure how that fits into the picture.
That is one that we have not considered with this lens yet. So that's a really good one to actually factor in across this. One might argue that some of the platformization of the services could maybe be offered through automation and AI. I don't have an answer to that. Obviously, this is a relatively new trend, but it would be really interesting to actually take a look at this with that in mind. So thank you. Yes, that's a really great avenue for consideration next. So thank you.
Thanks for the nice presentation. Just have a question. There is a broad spectrum of software development companies that we'll have, right? So there might be very startups who are just starting, and they probably are not contributing. They don't have any reason to contribute in the open source. You could have in the medium spectrum where it's a medium-sized company, lots of developers, but there is a reason that they actually want to contribute in the open source, and the developer starts doing that. And then there is a reason to have OSPO because the contribution is going on. And then you've got the large 100,000 kind of company, multinational companies, and you actually have a lot of people contributing in open source because that's the direction the whole industry across all the verticals is going in. So my question is, say in a multinational organization, we got an OSPO here, but the developers generally are not, developers are only interested in doing their development work and delivering. They are a different bunch of people. So how do we bring in that mindset in the developers that this is also quite important? It's a challenging one, I would say.
That is challenging, and this is one of the difficulties, right? Because if you say that that's your goal, I'm immediately, now that I've been looking at it with this Team Topologies lens, I'm thinking, so are you telling me that your job is to talk to my very valuable stream-aligned team and get them to take their eye off my ball and put it into contributing external to the company? Like, I can almost hear the reverberations in people's brains about that. And that's challenging, right? So that's you're coming from that from the perspective of what an OSPO might be thinking its role is. And I guess my reflection is that may not resonate with people who are thinking about it from this lens. So I don't have an answer to your question, and this may not actually help that question unless you make the case that there is a dependency of a very valuable stream-aligned team on a particular project, and that stream-aligned team will get to their goal faster by working with the experts that are the OSPO that will help them get to their goal faster. And so I suppose it's about this idea of how you pitch that. If you talk it theoretically, in terms of wouldn't it be great if we contribute, they're like, what do you mean? That's giving them more cognitive load. I'm trying to reduce the cognitive load. But if it's a pathway to value for your customer, then it begins to make sense in this context.
Yeah. Basically, what I was saying was, generally the developers are not interested in the licenses and those kind of activities, because they're only interested in coding. So
true.
To bring that mindset would be a challenge, I think.
Then it's making the case about the skills, and then you might need the enablement team to actually get them to a place. And so then you can start thinking about how you might frame the intervention you need to make in that context. Yeah, so that would require enabling work. Then, thank you. Stefano, did you need to?
No, I just had a quick question. Given the recent changes, like lots of OSPOs have been gutted, and did you see a pattern in your research, or are you aware of any research already starting to discover patterns?
So I have not done quantitative research in this space, so I've only had a limited set of interactions, and actually it's been mostly from the InnerSource perspective. But what I will say is that one observation I have is about this, that the OSPOs who are, I suppose, working with an internal focus have sometimes, some of their work has been sustained in different ways within the organization. But one of the things that has, in my, again, not necessarily statistically relevant, but in my observation, is that some of the external work has been cut. And my assumption from looking at it with this lens would be that that's because there hasn't been a tie made between, oh, you need to give me money for these projects, and there is just no way for executives who don't understand open source, and even if you've given them the education, the idea of making a connection between, you've given this money to this group of people over here, how on earth does that come back to the value for my customer? That's broken. And that just doesn't hold up in the competitive landscape of where they're at, where they're trying to automate developers away with their AI tools, or whatever the darling project of the day is, This is recorded.
Yeah, that's why we're not saying, but yeah, I know which teams are recorded and what. Yeah.
So.
Love to see that.
Okay.
Cool, thanks.
All right, well, before you all go, and because my cognitive load is now about to be tested, who thinks I should, when I say we, I mean I, who thinks I should explore this a little bit more and maybe provide some additional resources on it, or should I spend my time investigating some other area? So would people be interested in exploring this topic more and hearing more about it? Question? Hands up if you would. All right, that's enough to say yes. Okay, I'll take that. And my cognitive load has just gone up. But thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.